Chancellor George Osborne's estimates on the British economy, if they pull out, are complete nonsense. Professor John Weeks, SOAS University of London. This week, we've seen how China's economy has affected others such as New Zealand and Australia. Do you think, as China's economy weakens, there will be any way for these countries which are reliant on it to combat the impact? How?
Well, I think that the link is, in the case of Australia and New Zealand, is primarily through trade and not so much through investment, though there's a bit of that. And given that the world economy is slowing down overall, it's unlikely that there will be you could substitute instead of. So I think that there has to be domestic policies to expand demand. That is, exports represent a source of demand which generates employment and incomes and so on. So you have to substitute that with something else, and that's either private investment or government expenditure. And therefore, the governments of any country which is a major trading partner with China any such government needs to have some alternative demand expansion in mind. It's always difficult to expand private investment in any country because the government doesn't control private companies. So really you're down to a public expenditure.
On Obama's visit to the UK and Germany this week, some were critical of his forceful approach to Britain remaining in the EU. How would Britain's decision on Brexit affect the US financially, and why is Obama so keen to see united Europe?
I think the question of how, if Britain left the European Union, what impact would it have on the United States? Very, very difficult to predict what would happen. I mean, Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, put forward some estimates of the impact on the British economy of pulling out of the European Union. I think they were complete nonsense because you're trying to predict something that's completely uncertain, so historical parameters don't apply. I would say that it's not clear what would happen in the United States. I think it would be relatively minor, but that's just my opinion. As to why Obama considers it so important that Britain stay in the European Union, I think it's two things. One is geopolitical. I think he does see the European Union as a counterbalance to Russia. So at Cold War, second time around, as a very famous, I think it was Hegel said, first time tragedy, second time farce. And I think that Obama is clearly concerned with policy towards Russia. And second of all, he does seem to be completely committed to a corporate view of how international trade ought to be organized rather than a more balanced view. And so I think the combination of two, he's completely committed to the transatlantic trade deal. And if Britain were to pull out of the European Union, it would make its adoption, both in the United States and in Europe, much more difficult.
The Bank of Japan has surprised economists by holding off an expanding monetary stimulus to assess the impact of negative interest rates. What does the Bank of Japan need to do to overcome the current stagnation in their economy?
Well, this is a really difficult one. As you and your listeners will probably know, the Bank of Japan has been involved in monetary expansion, so-called quantitative easing, but really even before that became a common term. They've been doing that for quite a long time. And in addition to that, the government of Japan has from time to time, over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, engaged in fiscal expansion. Neither of those has proved effective in rejuvenating the Japanese economy, so it's hard to know what they should do. I think the basic problem, and here I think many experts on Japan and Japanese economists would agree, is there's a tremendous private debt overhang in Japan. During the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of private debt, corporate debt built up, and you may recall that the yen was appreciating at that time. Now, as a currency appreciates, it makes the real value of your debts even greater because that domestically that results in very low inflation or even deflation, and that's exactly what was happening in Japan. So not only did you have this debt overhang, but the real value of the debt, the real burden of the debt, of the private debt, was increasing. Until there's some mechanism for the reduction of private debts, I don't see any monetary stimulus being effective.
The Federal Reserve Bank left interest rates unchanged on Wednesday, but downplayed risks posed by global economic and financial developments to the US economy. What are these risks?
I would say the main risk to the U.S. economy is a return to accumulation of consumer debt. I mean, the crash of 2008 through 2010 in the United States was very much tied to consumer debt, not just the subprime mortgage crisis, but actually consumers having very large debts. And when the economy began to tank, then people had to start paying off those debts, and in effect, paying off your debt is a reduction in aggregate demand. So instead of buying things, you're paying off your debts. And that exacerbated the lack of aggregate demand in the U.S. economy. Consumer debt is building up again, and so again the economy is fragile in that way. Corporate debt is building up again. So those two are the major problems. On the world scale, it's much the same thing, and it is exacerbated by very low inflation. I mean, people may have a visceral reaction against inflation, but the great thing about moderate inflation is it erodes your debts, and it's a great way to have a simple, market-driven way to reduce the burden of debts. And instead of that happening, we're having the reverse. We're having actually debts becoming more burdensome as a result of very low inflation or even deflation.
That was Professor John Weeks speaking for the Weekly Wrap-Up. I'm Lucy Polferman, and that's it for this week at Dukascopy TV. Join us on Monday to keep up to date with everything FX. Bye for now.